The arena was already humming long before the first bell rang, a low electric tension rolling through the crowd like a gathering storm. This wasn't just another title fight or a routine defense. This was the kind of night boxing fans circle on their calendar months in advance. The kind of matchup that lives on bravado, reputation, and the dangerous promise that someone's narrative is about to be shattered. On one side stood Naoya Inoue, the man they called the Monster, a fighter whose resume read like a warning label. On the other was an opponent who had convinced himself and loudly tried to convince the world that Inoue's reign was built on illusion, that size mattered more than speed, and that the Japanese star was, in his words, nothing more than a midget hiding behind hype. It was trash talk meant to sting, meant to belittle, and meant to plant a seed of doubt. What followed would be a brutal lesson in karma. In the days leading up to the fight, the disrespect became impossible to ignore. Interviews were filled with dismissive smirks and careless comments about Inoue's stature, about how he was supposedly avoiding certain fighters, about how his power wouldn't translate against a real challenge. The narrative was clear and intentionally provocative. This wasn't just about winning a belt. It was about exposing a fraud, about humbling a star who, according to his critics, had been protected for far too long. Inoue, as he often did, said very little. He listened, he trained, and he let the noise pile up around him. Those who knew him well understood that silence wasn't indifference. It was focus. When the fighters finally made their walk to the ring, the contrast was striking. Inoue moved with calm purpose, eyes forward, shoulders loose, as if he were stepping into a familiar routine rather than a hostile battlefield. Across from him was a man radiating confidence, feeding off the crowd, convinced that this was his moment to prove everything he had said. The bell rang, applause thundered, and just like that, words stopped mattering. Only skill, composure, and courage remained. From the opening exchanges, it became clear that Inoue wasn't there to feel his way into the fight. His footwork was sharp and economical, his distance control almost surgical. He didn't rush, but he didn't retreat either. He studied, adjusted, and began to test his opponent's reactions with quick jabs and subtle feints. The so-called size advantage looked less intimidating when it couldn't find its target. Each missed punch seemed to drain a bit of that early confidence, placed by a growing frustration at how difficult Inoue was to pin down. By the fourth round, the tone of the fight had begun to shift decisively. Inoue started to expose small but critical holes in his opponent's defense, slipping just outside of danger and snapping punches back before counters could even form. His speed advantage was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, landing repeatedly on the chin, forcing defensive adjustments that only created new problems. The crowd reacted with every clean shot, each applause a reminder that momentum was swinging. What had been billed as a dangerous test was starting to resemble a masterclass. As the rounds wore on, Inoue's volume increased. He wasn't just landing single shots. He was building combinations, touching the body, then coming back upstairs, making his opponent think about too many things at once. To his credit, the other man was tough. He absorbed punishment without folding, tried to answer back, and refused to give in. But toughness alone doesn't win fights at this level, and the damage, while gradual, was unmistakably adding up. The face began to swell, the breathing grew heavier, and the footwork slowed just enough for Inoue to take even more control. By the middle rounds, the ring began to feel smaller for the challenger. Inoue pressed forward with calculated pressure, not reckless aggression, forcing him backward and into a defensive shell. The bully who had promised domination was now reacting instead of dictating, covering up as punches slipped through his guard. The footwork battle, something many had overlooked before the fight, was being won decisively by Inoue. He was outworking his opponent in every possible dimension, moving laterally, changing angles, and always staying one step ahead. By the 8th round, the evidence was written clearly across the challenger's face. Swelling had become obvious, and the rhythm of the fight belonged entirely to Inoue. This was no longer competitive in the eyes of most watching. Each round felt like a chapter repeating the same lesson. Speed beats size, intelligence beats arrogance, preparation beats trash talk. When blood appeared from the nose in the ninth, it was more than physical damage. It was symbolic, a visible crack in the image of invincibility that had been so loudly proclaimed before the fight. Still, Challenger refused to quit. Round after round, he stood his ground as best he could, taking punishment and trying to find moments to counter. But by the 10th, there was little left to praise beyond his resilience. Inoue was dictating everything, choosing when to engage, when to pull back, and when to let his hands go. The championship rounds loomed, and the situation was growing increasingly bleak as the fight entered its final stretch. The commentary shifted from analysis to admiration. This wasn't just about winning rounds anymore. It was about how completely Inoue was dismantling the narrative built against him. Observers noted that despite landing flush shots again and again, there were very few moments where the challenger showed any sign of seriously hurting Inoue. That in itself spoke volumes. The idea that Inoue was fragile, that he could be bullied physically, was evaporating under the bright lights. In the corner between rounds, desperation crept into the instructions. Calls to be busier, to dig to the body, to find something, anything, that could turn the tide. But those suggestions, easy to shout from a corner, were nearly impossible to execute against a fighter like Inoue. He was always ready with a counter, always positioned to punish mistakes. And with less than 4 minutes left in the fight, even the idea of body shots as a late strategy felt like a long shot. Whatever effect they might have had would need to be immediate. And there was no indication that time was on the challenger's side. The psychological shift was perhaps the most fascinating part of the final round. Before the fight, the mindset had been simple. This was a scared opponent who had been ducking a real challenge. By the 12th, that belief had collapsed entirely. The corner's rallying cries shifted from confidence to nationalism, from tactics to emotion, urging their fighter to do it for pride, for country, for something beyond the scorecards that were already out of reach. It was an unspoken admission that the fight had slipped away. As the final minute ticked down, Inoue seemed almost disappointed that a knockout hadn't come. He pressed, probing for openings, even as his opponent focused almost entirely on defense. And yet, even in a round where a knockout was desperately needed by one man, Inoue continued to find gaps, continued to land cleanly. It was another testament to the thoroughness of his performance, to how completely he had outclassed someone who had promised to overwhelm him then. In a dramatic twist, the challenger found his moment. A right hook landed in the dying seconds, wobbling Inoue and sending a ripple of shock through the arena. For a brief instant, there was uncertainty. Had Inoue been playing possum? Was he genuinely hurt? It was the kind of moment that reminds everyone why boxing is never truly predictable. But just as quickly as it arrived, it passed. The bell rang, and the fight was over. When the final scores were read, there was no controversy, no debate. This had been, for all intents and purposes, a shutout. One round at most could be argued for the challenger, but even that felt generous. The man who had talked about fear and size and dominance had been forced to confront a harsh reality. Inoue wasn't scared. He wasn't protected. He wasn't small in the ways that mattered. He was simply better. In the aftermath, the story wrote itself. All those claims that this opponent would be kryptonite for Inoue were proven wrong. The challenger was a good fighter, perhaps even an elite one in his own right. But this night made something else clear. There are levels to this game, and Naoya Inoue exists on a level few can reach. He is a generational talent, a fighter whose skills transcend divisions and defy lazy narratives. Built on physical measurements alone, the insult that once echoed so loudly now rang hollow. Calling Inoue a midget had been an attempt to reduce him, to strip away the aura that surrounded him. Instead, it only amplified the moment when karma came calling. Because when the bell rang and fists flew, the only thing that mattered was what happened between those ropes. And what happened was domination. This fight will be remembered not just for the clean work, the precision, or even the late scare, but for what it represented. It was a reminder that boxing has a way of punishing arrogance and rewarding discipline. It was a reminder that silence can be louder than trash talk, and that true greatness doesn't need to announce itself. Naoya Inoue walked into the ring disrespected by some, doubted by others. and walked out reaffirming why he is called the monster. Now, the questions turn to the future. What challenges remain for a fighter who continues to dismantle every test placed in front of him? Who, if anyone, can solve the puzzle that so many before have failed to crack? As fans, we're left in awe, but also in anticipation of what comes next. What's your take on Naoya Inoue's performance?